what is the English identity? Is it chips, Strictly Come Dancing and Match of the Day? Is that all we've got? Because I'd like a little bit more.
Welcome to Talking Shop, the Communities Inc. podcast. Episode 2. Why do we need antiracists?
Hi everyone, my name's Shamsha. I'm joined today by Manjit and Richard. Manjit, if I come to you first, could you just tell us who you are and what you do and about your organisation?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. I'm Manjit Sahota. I'm the co-founder of Poets Against Racism. Started in 2016 in a workshop with Love Music, Hate Racism. We had a group of poets who decided to get themselves together and form Poets Against Racism, to be able to use their poetry, spoken word, and their art to challenge racism, and also raise awareness about the need to support refugees. So it's poets using their art form to bring a broad audience around the issue of challenging bigotry and racism.
Great, thank you. And Richard, do you want to tell us who you are and the organisation that you're involved in?
Yes, I'm Richard Buckwell, and I'm Joint Secretary of Nottingham Stand Up to Racism, which I think I've been Joint Secretary with Talani Molieff, who used to be a City Councillor, I think for about 5 years now, and Stand Up to Racism in Nottingham, and nationally, I think it's been going about 7 or 8 years. And I've been involved with various anti-racist organisations over many years. Stand Up to Racism, I think, is probably the largest one nationally now. Work very closely with the trade unions, which is a lot of my background as well. And we try and have a presence at a lot of community events. So there's a place people can find to go to who experience racism, and something we have noticed that where things are happening in the city and around the city, people now are starting to come to us and know we exist, which is very important.
Great, thank you. And if I could ask, both of you, do we still need active resistance against racism? Is there still a place for that?
Well,
sadly, yes, I think we do, don't we, Richard? Really?
Certainly do. I'm thinking of toxic Tories.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
I think it would be great to. I've always said I wish I didn't have an organisation called Poets Against Racism in a world that'd be ideal. But it's a sort of there is a continual, like Richard says, an agenda from right-wing governments, particularly now globally, to persecute minorities, persecute refugees, and that sort of triggers a whole load of reactionary sentiments from governments whipping up racism and talking about borders, which creates the fear and creates the idea that you're being invaded all the time, and particularly this government, the Tory government, talking about the invasion through dinghies and boats. That creates an atmosphere as an island. You start feeding into the sort of small island mentality, and it's frightening. So that sort of racism is fueled by governments, but the results on the ground are it encourages the bigots on the street to continually to persecute and attack. Yeah. So the challenge is just as big as it has been for decades, really, I think.
Yeah, the real worry is their words end up in deeds by others, and the consequences of some of the language being used, particularly last week by Lee Anderson, his local MP, and having worked in Ashfield for 30 years, I'm quite embarrassed by, this person is meant to be representing what people think there. Yeah. Because I think the corollary to what you were saying, Manjit, is although there's a big rise in racism, I am heartened by many people out there who actually are standing up against this, ordinary people, and particularly towards refugees and asylum seekers. I also volunteer as a Care for Calais volunteer, working with asylum seekers, And when new hotels have been opened, people who've never been engaged in political things before, coming forward, donating clothes and really basic things, which, is absolutely fantastic. So, on the one hand, the world is getting a lot worse, it seems, but on the other, there's an awful lot of people who said that enough is enough of this. We stand for fairness and humanity.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting thing, because actually being an activist or being an artist and doing something gives you gets you a lot more hope, really, because you meet people who are in the fight, in the resistance to do something, and they're active. Because otherwise, if you just looked at the world on TV and thought there's no one out there doing it, that's what you'd start to worry, that you start to believe the leaders. And what's good about using poetry and using activism and being active on the streets and on stage is you get a chance to put the message across that there is a resistance, there are more of us than them, and we need to keep the resistance going, and that's important.
Yeah, I mean, it could be quite hard work, can't it? It'd be quite taxing on, our own mental health, as it were. And I know that, in the experience that we've had in terms of raising awareness around hate crime, it's those moments where you meet other people that are doing that work, and it just refreshes you, and it just sort of reignites the passion, because you know that you're not on your own, and that's quite important, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I think every time you get organisations who whip up racism, whatever they're called now, patriotic, alternative, BNP, EDL, far right groups, you get hundreds of people turning up in towns like Long Eaton and smaller towns, and showing them that they're not going to whip up the racism in that area. So getting out on the streets and seeing the work that people are doing, Stand Up to Racism and other anti-racist groups, it keeps your mental health well, actually. And I'd encourage someone to be an activist. It's good for your mental health. It's tiring, but it's like a good tiring. It's a good tired.
Yeah, I think the worst thing for your mental health is just to read the media and the social media. If you just concentrated on that, you really would get very, very depressed. But if you get out there, certainly at the moment, and there's no guarantee it will happen. It can only depend on continual activity, which is quite exhausting. We have managed to get out every time, I think recently, more people than the far right have, and their gatherings have got smaller locally, which is being very encouraging for us, and that reinforces what you're doing is right and is needed. So yes, I think that's the most important thing. The activity keeps you alive. Yeah,
that sort of apathy is quite draining, isn't it, when you feel powerless. But then getting involved, getting active with other people brings a sense of community, brings a sense of purpose as well, doesn't it? That you're actually contributing to something more positive.
And actually it's a contrast. I can remember the 70s where we were outnumbered quite a lot. I was really frightened on some demonstrations, and we actually have changed around the situation. At the moment there's no guarantee, but certainly the world, I think, is a lot better than the hate that was around in the 70s. And I can remember that there still are murders today, but the Paki bashing, the skinheads that were around, they certainly weren't all far right skinheads by any means, but there was a lot more physical fear, I think, mass fear out there than there is at the moment, and their weakness is they pick on individuals rather than able to stage mass, really intimidating demonstrations, which will be the biggest worry. I mean, it has happened in other countries, and I'm pleased we haven't got to that situation.
It's interesting that you mentioned the 70s, because I was going to ask, how do you think racism has changed? I grew up as a child in the 70s, and it was the National Front. It was very explicit. It was very vocal. How has that changed over the decades?
I was thinking about when I got involved early on. I can remember there was a strike for racism, in effect, at Imperial Typewriters in Leicester, just down the road, and going to there, and that was the majority position. I mean, over the years that's changed around in Leicester. I think totally different situation there now, but that's when I talk about being in the majority on the streets as we are now, compared with times in the 70s where I really was quite frightened.
And it was a really difficult time. I had been a young teenager in the 70s. Enoch Powell and his Rivers of Blood speech in Wolverhampton 1968, and remembering what that meant for all my uncles in the West Midlands, in Birmingham, in the car factories, in the foundries. You know, these are generations of African Caribbean, Asian workers who were, you know, working in those environments. And then Enoch Powell whipped up this again fear of being swamped, which Thatcher later used in the 80s, and it immediately put you, no matter how hard you worked, immediately put you in an alien feel that you were not welcome. And that sort of racism and the brutality on the streets by the skinheads, like Richard says, was quite a frightening childhood. But what was great was there were trade union organisations, there were anti-racist, there was the Anti-Nazi League, and I was active through my father being in the Indian Workers Association and the Anti-Nazi League, and that seemed to blend working with people in the workplace with working with activists on the street, and that really has kept us to a point where we aren't looking over our shoulder and worrying about which building we walk into. It's been the dedication of people like Richard and activists that we've been able to say, the more you stand up and fight, the more room we've got to breathe. And that's so key, isn't it?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. There's a woman called Sonia Long who still keeps going Rock Against Racism in the city, and going to some of the gigs. There are people who came into this movement in the 70s through Rock Against Racism, and it's just great they're still around.
Yeah.
And I, like Manjit, I suppose really got involved at that time. I lived in London, around the corner from Spurs, and we set up an organisation called Spurs Against the Nazis. We've faced a lot of discrimination, large Jewish area supporters, and we had a lot of problems with the National Front, and that was a real turnaround as well, and it's lived on.
So who are the other significant players that do work around anti-racism? You know, you talked about, you know, the trade unions and the Indian Workers Association and the Anti-Nazi League. Who else is in this field that you now work with?
Well, from my point of view, I think it's very important that the trade unions, almost to a union, are signed up with Stand Up Against Racism, supported a lot of the activities, and it's great to see all their union logos on that, because that's, you know, 6 million trade union members. I think we need more work to get trade union members out on things quite often, but it's great to see their union banners on occasions when there are forces out there. I think people on the far right, you know, do see that there are workers' organisations supporting us, and that is just so important.
Yeah.
And for me, it's doing poetry in schools, in Nottingham schools, and with organisations. I'm in the middle of a summer scheme feeding kids through with Forest in the community, and we're running a number of activities, including spoken word poetry, how to be a poet. What it leads to when the poetry is discussed is about issues, and a lot of young people are quite strongly committed to challenging racism and bigotry and sexism. So it's very much in the centre. That's such an important thing to keep going with young people, and I'm full of hope when young people always come up and say, well, that's great, you know, we need to be making sure people aren't discriminated. So I think the schools have a big role to play, the universities, the unions. I think that's the reality. Is a lot of people are, if they don't seem to be active, but they're clearly opposed to racism. So the more they get connected to how they can get involved, the better, really. So I've got a lot of hope in terms of how we challenge it, and I think that a lot of organisations are committed to an anti-racist policy or a non-racist policy, and I suppose that the active bit is the one we're interested in. When it comes to mobilising people, it's great to say we don't have any racism in our workplace, we don't put up with it. Then it's actually, well, why don't you bring a delegation of yourselves to the march? The more we spread the word, the better. So I think the opportunities are endless. I think there's a big resistance there, which is good.
And going back to sport and football, I think Show Racism Red Cards have been a
yeah.
really good organisation. I went down to one of their days at County a few years back, and they had significant numbers of school kids from about 12 primary schools locally there, having a really good day with the players coming in, talking about racism with them. And I think starting at that age, people who they respect, saying which side they're on, I think is tremendously important.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned sports. I mean, obviously in the last couple of years, there's been a number of different sports areas sort of where there's been high profile cases around racism.
Yeah.
Why do you think those incidents are still occurring and not being, is it that they're not being dealt with? Is it, why are we still seeing and hearing these high profile cases?
I think it's interesting, isn't it? I think the word institutional racism is really difficult to see until you see it, until you see an entire old guard of a cricket board in Yorkshire who don't think they're doing anything by stopping people getting access to cricket fields, don't think they need to do anything, and realise actually they're sitting on an institution that itself is perpetuating inequality. And when they have instances where they say, well, it's banter, it's just a bit of conversation, and you have the results of the mental health crisis cricket players going through, then you still have Premier League footballers having death threats by phone, and still people going, well, what can we do? That? And that's the weird thing about challenging it, that isn't the normal world. It's a big profile events, but I think institutions have to look at themselves and say, well, if we're going to take racism serious, we should be supporting Show Racism the Red Card. There should be more. And I think that dialogue, and it's important to talk about racism rather than to not talk about it and think you're doing something that's positive. Hiding something and letting it just simmer away and not challenging it is very dangerous because it pops up in a more ferocious way. So more dialogue to talk about how we challenge racism with the institutions would would transform them into being more accessible. But yeah, it's still shocking. What I'm shocked is some of the language used by, predominantly white male middle class men at the top of organisations, and thinking that's fine, because they're not challenged.
I think particularly with cricket, I think you've got to bring in the whole class base of cricket, and that's why I think probably in many respects it's worse than football, a lot harder to deal with football, whereas a lot of the football clubs now, there are active anti-racist groups, and they're also working well with LGBT plus groups at those football grounds, and there's nothing like that exists in cricket. It does vary a lot, I think, from sport to sport, and I also cycle a lot, and it's really great seeing some black cyclists starting to come through and doing really well, because I think that was another sport that was very white and very hard to get into if you weren't white.
So I mean, talking about institutional racism, over the decades there's been different perspectives. Following the murder of Stephen Lawrence, there was a recognition and acknowledgement that the Metropolitan Police were institutionally racist. There's been other reports over sort of a couple of years ago that said there is no institutional racism. Again, more recently, the Met have been challenged about some of the behaviours and attitudes around women, LGBT people and black people. There's been a reluctance with the current commissioner to sort of say that there is institutional racism. How much of a role do you think that continues to play within large organisations in perpetuating some of these negative attitudes and behaviours?
Well, I think there's a particular problem with the police is because its very existence is based on, being institutionally racist, being an oppressive organisation. So, the whole defunding the police movement, I think, is very important, because by its very nature, you're not going to get rid of it. I think it's different in other public bodies, which have, more subject to democratic control, and the unions can have some role in it as well. Makes a big difference to improving the presence of those, particularly, local authorities. Over the years, things have got a lot better, and as I say, I come from London. I do remember the GLC in those days, that I think people set it up there as being something to target, but it did a lot of very good things. It did open up room for debate and, made a big difference to how we see ourselves.
Yeah.
I find it funny when people say we're bigots, but we're not organised. That's like looking like we're racist, but we're not institutionally racist. And to even fight over defending whether you're organised bigots or not is quite interesting. That an organisation has to say, well, calm down, and then that's part of the problem. Is the more you expose the role of an organisation, and then you find that their history of sexism and homophobia and racism, they're built on that almost. And we'd be interested to look at what mentality a police force is supposed to have. What's it protecting? And predominantly, historically, it's protecting property and crime against major property. And it's quite interesting how the role of institutions like that play in fighting racism, because the question of how long are we going to do this fighting racism? I mean, you do it, but you go at some point. Major changes have to take place. It can't all be activists on the ground doing it every time there's an incident. It's actually stopping the instances, and I think the institutions need to be much more clear about coming out and challenging racism rather than fighting to defend their organisation. And that's where the danger is. They come to protect themselves, and they perpetuate that image that they're sort of a closed shop, if you like.
Yeah.
But I think that the pressure for good, I thought, was seen when we had those awful murders in Nottingham, end of June, was it?
Yeah.
And actually, the response by people in Nottingham was by and large very good, and I was down at the vigil in the square, and it was very moving. And I thought, there was such a lot of pressure on people to say no to hate crime, and don't blame someone because of the colour of their skin.
Yeah.
I think things like that are so very important, because it could well have gone the wrong way, without people standing up and being quite outspoken about don't blame anyone else. I had tremendous admiration for the families who got up and spoke and said those kind of things as well.
And they're really important things to say. We will not be divided by hate, and then look after each other, and the predominantly feeling of love coming out rather than hate. And it came a couple of days before Refugee Week in Nottingham, and that was really important, because it fed into the fact that we should be a compassionate, loving city to support everybody who lives there and refugees. So that was so important, because it could have been exploited.
Well, the launch of Refugee Week, we had a minute's silence for those killed in Nottingham, as well as those who'd just been drowned on that ship just off Greece.
I mean, do you think, just something slightly different, do you think in the past it used to be that people would almost say that being called racist was the worst thing that could happen? People feared that, didn't they? They feared that label. I remember working with an organisation, and it was an organisation that worked with men who have sex with men, and they were having difficulties in relating to and engaging black and Asian men. And we had a very honest conversation with them, where we were saying, what are some of the barriers that you're facing, when you're going into these environments. And when it came down to it, they were saying, well, we don't want to be called racist, or we don't want people to assume that we're making assumptions about what their behaviour is and what they're going to be doing. And they really felt that it was genuinely the worst thing that could happen if somebody thought that they were racist. And we had to actually sort of, put it to them, well, actually, if you fail to do your job in terms of giving information around sort of how to keep safer, protecting yourself, what you're actually doing is you're putting these men in a position where potentially, we'd suggest that the worst thing that could happen is, because they lack that information, because they lack the resources, they end up putting themselves at risk. They could get infected with HIV, and then they could die. And that's probably the worst thing that could happen. And it was quite a wake-up call for these guys. And it was like, this realisation that actually, that had been used as a barrier to engage, and suddenly actually there was something worse than being called racist. But that was a real big thing sort of 25 years ago. Do you think people are still scared of that now? Do you think people still fear that label?
It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I think the worst thing is to not be professional. I mean, that's a key thing, is to say, in this instance, I'll do my job and I'll be professional. On this occasion, I'll worry about the impact this might have or be perceived as. So why would you give a different type of service to different groups? And the danger is you end up falling into stereotypes about cultures that is almost a bigotry at a bias point in the first place. If there's discrimination happening in a community, you challenge it on the same principle as that you're an anti-racist or you've got some equality about you, rather than worrying about upsetting a group of community. If it, and that's always been a tricky one. It stands in the history of challenging racism. I've been a youth worker in this city, working alongside white colleagues, and they said if there's a racist incident, we're not going to rely on Manjit to deal with it. It's our job to challenge racism. It's our job to challenge discrimination in different communities. So what do I do as an active white anti-racist in this team to challenge oppression? What's my role? As a male, what do I do to challenge sexism? So it's that, I think, why would you water down your professionalism when you're faced with a challenge? And you're right, be honest about it's a difficult issue, but being a professional and being clearer that you've got principles, it's always key, I think.
Well, I think as someone who's white, if you don't respond, you're seen to be colluding with it.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important. The other thing I'd like to say is, having worked in a place with strong trade union tradition, I think it's also important that people feel they can speak openly about these things, because sometimes, people aren't responding and they still have some racist views, and you need to find some mechanism where they feel it's not something that's been hammered on you. You need to talk about it, and so you can explain things like this. We had quite a good group in the city. It still exists to some extent, called the Difficult Conversations Group, which we had a group together which were talking about how you can develop arguments to discuss with people over a whole number of situations, and I think that's got quite a useful function as well.
You said something about, when you don't respond, you're colluding with it. That's exactly the message that we send when we're talking about being the bystander.
Yeah.
If it's in an work environment and somebody's saying something that's derogatory or belittling, by not responding, by not saying anything, what you end up doing is sending the message to the person that's affected that you don't really care about them or the impact it has on them. And actually the person that's doing that behaviour never gets the message that their behaviour is not right.
Yeah.
That it's not appropriate, and that's what ends up, they continue that behaviour, and then there's always that potential for that to escalate. So it very much is there's a quote by Desmond Tutu: if you are silent in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the perpetrator. And it's exactly that. If we're not doing anything to counter it, then we're actually sort of colluding and supporting that. That's not to say that we have to make great big massive gestures and enter into great big debates. When we talk about our interventions, we talk about simple things just by showing disapproval. Not laughing at a racist joke. If you don't laugh at a racist joke, that person that's telling the joke will get the message that you don't find that very funny.
I think
the
you've got to do more.
The chances are they probably won't tell you another racist joke again.
I think you've got to say, I don't find that funny.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, isn't it? It's creating an environment where it's not safe to be a racist, at whatever level you do it at. Whether it's organised on the street, and whether it's in a workplace, they don't feel confident they can perpetuate racism or sexist views, and it'll be somehow seen as the natural culture of the area. Because it is that thing about it. It's not a static situation. We don't live in a vacuum. There are constant waves of reactionary ideas, and there's always a need to be organised and challenging it and finding different ways of doing it, and refreshing anti-racist approaches. And I think sometimes you don't have the model anti-racist group that everybody has to copy. In fact, that would be a really narrow base. What you need is everybody's anti-racist policies and approach in an umbrella. And actually the more, and I like the difficult conversations groups and the trade unions and the CUC, the more groups you have, the harder it is for that reactionary sort of racism to find oxygen. So I think Nottingham, I've been here over 30 years, Nottingham's got a fantastic cultural and community anti-racist history, quite proud city of it, and I think that's something to build on.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you're talking about, reinventing how you take the message across, something Communities Inc. does really well, the myth-busting little leaflets we do, and working with asylum seekers, the need to actually continually update them to deal with the arguments that change from week to week quite often, or the whole situation about the barge in Portland, is something you need to put in, and I think you need to keep doing those things so they're out there. You're not necessarily going to change people's minds overnight by quoting these things to them, but you're chipping away all the time. And I'd also like to echo what Manjit's saying about Nottingham as feeling a safe place. Asylum seekers who come here want to stay here, don't want to be moved to somewhere else by and large, and I think that says quite a lot about the city, and it, by and large in town, it's a safe place to walk around.
Yeah.
I mean, over the decades there's been several challenges, more recently sort of Brexit, the EU referendum, COVID. In fact, after the EU referendum, reported hate crimes went up across the country by 30%. Nottinghamshire had the second highest increase at 75% increase. And that was across the board. That wasn't just around racism, that was around misogyny, that was around homophobia. It was hatred towards any group of people just increased because it just seemed like people felt more comfortable displaying that and expressing that. So just coming back to sort of, what are the current challenges that your respective organisations are facing at the moment?
Well, picking up on that, I think the reason it went up is the powerless people felt. I think a lot of the Brexit vote was people wanting to kick back, and this was a way they could do it because they've had so little power about things. So I think that is one of the biggest challenges, and that is why the right of growing, worldwide, that is such a challenge. And I think the way over the last year we had quite a number of strikes. I think that can potentially change things if people feel more confident about demanding of their employer they get their rights and so on. We don't think we've had any huge victories yet, but we've not been stomped down. The game's still open on that, and I think what happens in that field will make a big difference.
I think it's a similar. I get a feeling as a poet is looking at the voice that's lost. That alienated voice that ends up being used by people on the right to whip up hate against others, and it's that lost voice of going, I've lost an identity here. And a lot of time people say, what is English? What is the English identity? Is it chips, Strictly Come Dancing and Match of the Day? Is that all we've got? Because I'd like a little bit more. And I think you also have to say, well, let's go hand in hand through Europe and around the world, and you tell me which hotels we can all get into. You tell me which palaces we can all visit for free. And you realise that actually we've got more in common, but actually because we do feel a bit left out when they put the barriers up and they put the palaces drawbridge up. So there is an element of class and rich and the powerful, I thought that bitterness, there's not enough. That's what the right have always built on. There's not enough houses, not enough health, but then the people who are saying that are in papers that are launching rockets for billions of pounds they can't use anywhere else. So it's that thing about, well, why do you feel lost? Who's betrayed you? Who's left you behind? And I think ignoring voices that say there's something I'm feeling alienated and lost here. Ignoring them and seen as just racist is a danger, because predominantly you're not listening to why the conditions that make people feel disconnected. A lot of the time, that's why doing events and having carnivals and having music and having discussion brings people together to discuss how do we all get better housing, how do we all get better health service, well, how do we all get rid of governments that are continually using us as like pawns in a chess game, and that creating mistrust is the technique of a lot of governments at the moment, and what we need to do is make sure we constantly build that trust amongst people.
And I guess that's why those difficult conversations are important, because it gives a voice to some of those concerns, and once it's voiced, it can be addressed. You can engage in that. You can maybe even get a better understanding, or even look at collective ways of being able to address some of that.
The ones I've been involved in, they've been really important, and it's like challenging the hard subjects is really important, because it's easy just to think that everything's okay and everybody's nice, and you realise actually that's not how the way the world is, and it's really dangerous to think everything's horrible and there's nothing we can do. Somewhere you've got to be able to get a balance and to work out a strategy, I suppose. How do we all get there?
And I think you've got to be able to show some successes as well, and that involves activity. I'm thinking of the NHS in particular. That there's some big arguments about the NHS, but it wouldn't be run without migrants running it at the moment. And I think it's absolutely disgraceful that they're now going to be charged more for coming over here to run our NHS, and then being charged for actually using it if they do need to. Yeah.
So, this term anti-racist, if somebody's thinking, what does that mean? If somebody wants to be doing something around tackling racism, what are people doing? What are people saying when they're being anti-racist? What does that actually mean?
I think it's doing something positive with people from perhaps a different culture, different colour, to the improved conditions, not only of them, but in the end it will improve the conditions of everyone as a result. And I think it's a way of stopping communities being divided. That's probably the most important thing. Anti-racist is for unity.
So it's almost preventing those situations where that division starts creating harm towards people.
I think it's also being part of something, being part of a movement. And the one thing we sometimes don't talk about as artists and activists, it transforms you. Without question. I would be, if I wasn't involved in so many anti-racist histories of organisations, I wouldn't be the person I am now. Actually, by involving yourself in struggling together with people of different backgrounds, you transform yourself in terms of being a lot more confident that things can change. So being an anti-racist is actually quite it's not always hard work. It's tough, but the optimism is that you find other people and other cultures, and you expose yourself to experiences that you would never have had if you weren't an anti-racist. You would have a much more narrower view of the world, and being anti-racist means you build that broader, we call it a carnival of colour, of difference, rather than just a grey version of what the world should be. And that's the brilliant thing about being anti-racist. It's quite a joyful but active experience.
Yeah, you're learning all the time, broadening your mind. I think getting a new look at history and the richness of history in other countries, other places. And through years at school, you were just taught one history from British history, and then having a multicultural history. It's just so rich, and you get a totally different perspective on life.
Making those links is so important. Looking back at, one of my poems, was written while I was sitting in an Indian restaurant and thinking, how did I get here? And I realised it's the British Empire. If my father hadn't come here in 1952, if the British Empire didn't exist, if the British didn't exist in terms of in Africa and globally, we're all part of a plan that someone else put in place. And that, again, we are responding to living in different islands together. And what we do is make the best of that and look at the best of people, but at the result of someone who decided to, take the resources of a country, with military power. So in a way, we're living under the shadow of the empire, a terrible thing, and should be challenged. But as a consequence, we've met each other, and we've built worlds and communities where we resist racism. So there's a positive to that. So that's always good.
And I think asylum seekers who've struggled to get here, I mean, the amount of go you need and courage you need to get here, I mean, they're incredible people, and the skills they want to offer and be used, what we're missing out on by not making them part of the community is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
I remember when my mum followed my dad in the early 60s from India, from a small village in India, northern India. She told us that she was the first woman to ever leave her village to go abroad.
Yeah.
So she was walked by most of the village. It was a very small village, it's bigger now. Walked down to the local bus station by most of the village people that lived there in the early hours of the morning, when she, as a woman in her early 20s with a young child, got on a bus to Delhi and then got on a flight to come to England. And I have, I get quite emotional thinking about that. I have a huge admiration for somebody, going through that. And it must have been, hugely challenging. I just want to, finish off on some hope. I mean, you both spoke about being part of a much bigger movement than it has been in the past. What are your hopes for the future?
My hope is reiterating the fact that majority of the time we go into communities and into schools and in universities and into workplaces, people are genuinely, I feel, good people. I think they know the challenges of what governments are telling them, and I think you get a sense that there is hope with building a message that we should be tolerant, where love is stronger than hate, but also in that when things do happen, when racism does rear its head and organised by the right, connecting with those people is the key thing, and getting them together so they can see that there's more of us in challenging racism. But it's so important to keep that momentum going, because through history is if you do nothing and you don't connect, the gaps start to appear, and in those gaps the right wing or helped by governments will grow. So stay active, be active, connect with people, and I think that if Nottingham's one example of it, it's got a rich tradition, and that's why we're proud of the anti-racist connections and groups we've got here. So positive, really.
Yes, and I think some of the asylum seekers who've now got leave to remain, who are now working here, they're really providing something for the community. So I think that primacy must be on things individuals can do, but overall I'd like to see some of the government policies being forced to back down on some of the things they're doing at the moment, and that would make a huge difference, because if they're forced not to put more people on barges or into those camps, then it'll put them into less disrespect. It'll mean the far right won't be looking up to them, and that's a way to improve things for everyone.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for all the work that you do. Thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.